I'll speak briefly about the Center on Human Trafficking Research and Outreach before I can make my presentation. So we are also very much interdisciplinary. We have faculty from economics, international affairs, social work, sociology, statistics, psychology, and public health. And the reason why we are arranging that way is because the subject that we deal with, which is human trafficking, knows no discipline. Human trafficking is an international affairs issue because a number of victims, cross borders. Human trafficking is a public health issue, especially when you speak about sex trafficking. Human trafficking is a social work issue because when you speak about survivors and the services that they need. Human trafficking is a political science issue because right now we are seeing that even though we are very strong, what is called bilateral labor agreements between countries like in sub-Saharan Africa and in the Arabian Peninsula, we still have people who go there and really get practically enslaved, like slavery, as in you have absolutely no rights whatsoever. So human trafficking is, it's cross-cutting, and I've learned a lot by actually working with people from other disciplines. I'm also affiliated with the School of Public and International Affairs at the University of Georgia, so I'm very comfortable to be among people who study international affairs and international issues. The center also is a collaboration between the University of Georgia and the University of Liverpool in the UK. So myself and Alex Balch came up with this idea of the center. So we are kind of co-founders. Alex Balch is a professor at the University of Liverpool in the UK, and is a professor of international affairs. Even though there they call it a professor of politics. He's got a professor of politics, but it's like international affairs. Yeah, so very much international. We have about close to 20 faculty right now who are affiliated or who are very much heavily involved. We have about 10 graduate students, and we have about 20 staff across the US, the UK, and a few countries in Africa. Currently, our engagement and research are in 4 main countries, which is Sierra Leone, Senegal, Zambia, and Malawi. And in those countries, we have like heavy research with implementation, with monitoring and evaluation with many partners. So the last thing I want to say about some of my work, I also collaborate very closely with the United Nations. Right now, I have a grant with the International Labour Organization where we are trying to develop uniform indicators for trafficking for forced labor. So that is one area that is very much neglected. So I do travel to Geneva a little bit, and we have a lot of collaboration trying to really work very closely with the United Nations and also the UNODC and also the IOM, that is the International Organization on Migration. The IOM used to be very separate from the UN, but now it is part and parcel of the United Nations, just like UNICEF or UNHCR. So again, thank you. And I'm going to go straight now into my presentation. By the way, that if you see the flag of the US, because that is a required branding, we are mostly funded by the US Department of State, even though we have other funders as well. But that branding is required for any work, any presentation that comes from this grant by the US Department of State. So this is a background just of what I'm going to talk about, how we want to speak about immigration within and out of Africa, what really is causing this migration. We want to look at the intersection between migration and human trafficking. I'm also going to speak about a case study of our work in Zambia and Malawi, but the data that I have today is basically on Malawi. And then, of course, we'll just have the most important and to me the most fun part of any presentation, which is an open discussion. So just a few definitions. Migrant is somebody who moves, from where they live to another place. Usually there are many reasons that why people move. Sometimes they are forced to move. Other times they choose to move. And of course, right now, this is a big topic in this country. But you have people who move from one place to another place looking for work. Those are called migrant workers. And then labor migration basically are people who are looking for employment in other places. Sorry, I think the formatting there, I'm very sorry that it's not so close. The concept of movement, people moving, by the way, the movement of people is something that has been there from time immemorial, right? Nearly every person or every generation of people have moved from some place to another. So migration is part and parcel of the human experience. So there are many factors that actually cause this. Some are at the personal level, So for some of us, like myself, for example, I decided that I wanted to go to graduate school. Then after graduate school, I decided to stay because I got a job, But sometimes people move personally because of reasons which may not be that positive. Like there is war, or there is persecution, And of course, there are differences between a migrant and people who are seeking asylum and refugees. And we can speak about that later. Now, there could be social demographic factors, so I put with that structural issues. Governments could have issues. There could be civil conflict. Right now, with global warming, many people are getting displaced. People are moving a lot. If you look at something like Lake Chad, which is in Nigeria, that is where we have Boko Haram, for those who've heard. This is something that is not spoken about. Lake Chad has shrunk by about 70%. It used to provide livelihood to people. And all these people, all these issues that you see about Boko Haram, like this militant group, part of it is just the fact that a lot of the livelihood that these people had has actually been lost. And like that they depended on has actually shrunk by close to 60 to 70%, Lake Chad, and you could Google that. The economic reasons and the political reasons why people move. So within the continent of Africa, there's a lot of movement. And this pattern has been there over the past at least 2 decades. And, the number of migrant workers also within Africa has moved a lot. It's about 43 million people. So the map covers that by about 43 million people are right now in or out of Africa. But Africa is a very huge continent. If you look at the map of Africa, the geographers who are here can tell you that Africa, I think, includes the US, all of Western Europe, China, maybe Russia. That is Africa, It's a huge continent, actually, So it's unbelievable to imagine that the US, Western Europe, and China, all of this will actually fit into this continent that we call Africa. So within the continent, limited opportunities in some countries is a reason. There's a lot of conflict in some African countries. Right now, the issue of Sudan has been going on for a long time, where we have 2 military units which are fighting each other. Reports say that at least 20,000 people have been killed and at least 10 million people have been displaced in Sudan alone right now. Repressive governments, some governments really are very, very hard on people. And every time, I think, if you remember in the summer, there's a lot of young people coming up, like in Kenya, in my country, Kenya, you saw young people going to the streets and saying that they could not take it. They could not take it anymore. So we have these young continents with limited opportunities. They are very educated. We have the internet. They understand the world better than we did during our time. Then, of course, the other issues like climate change. So because of all this, it is not possible to expect that people will stick to one location or one place. So let's go a little bit deep into some of these factors. Limited economic opportunities. You look at, the continent, which has 23 of the 28 most impoverished states in Africa, and I'm working in some of those. Malawi is one of the poorest countries in the world, and Sierra Leone also is one of the poorest countries in the world. So if you look at the intersection of, the states are poor, and by the way, when I say poor, I just mean by GDP and all those things. We know that Africa is the wealthiest continent in the whole world, in terms of natural and mineral resources, right? So usually I like to clarify that, in terms of poverty, in terms of people being able to meet their needs, yes, but in terms of the resources, of course, those are political issues. So if you look at the intersection of young people, limited opportunities, the population is growing. So the economies have grown yet, but the population has grown even further, even higher or faster. And the fact that we have these young people, then you see why they would want to move, and also why there is conflict. So all these things intersecting. So they're young, they're looking for opportunities. They can't find opportunities. The governments are not functioning as well as they should, and they're agitating. And so there's conflict, and sometimes in the process of conflict or repression, some of them are forced to leave or move. So if you look at conflict, we have what is called the Sahel region. Like if Ethiopia, Sudan, the Central African Republic, Chad, all those countries have had lots of instability over a long period of time. And also that is another cause of migration. So every time there is instability in a country, people really move a lot. There's a book by, I think he's a political scientist, I think from Oxford, I think Paul Collier. It's called The Bottom Billion. And he speaks about the four, what are they called? Like the four. Yeah, exactly. And one of them is conflict. And he says, I think in one that I read like 10 years ago, but I think I still remember. He says, like, I think for every 1 year of conflict, the country goes back 49 years in terms of development. I think that is what Paul Collier says. So conflict is a bad thing. And really, if you look at a country like Sierra Leone, where right now we have work, they had an 11-year-old civil conflict, 11 years of conflict. So you can imagine what that, no production, no nothing, 11 years of conflict. So conflict is really not a good thing. Causes displacement, affects young people, it reduces development. Actually, countries go back in terms of development. So I'm not going to speak a lot about this because this is kind of related with what we just spoke about, but governance issues and being accountable and issues of corruption, those issues are real. And I'm not saying those issues are only found in Africa. Those issues are found here too. But if they are found in a country which is already poor, it really affects those countries, and the effects are, I think, more severe for the young people who live in those countries. So again, going deep into youth, we are a young continent. Africa is a very, 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 very young continent. Most of the countries in Africa, if you look at the median age, is between 18 and 22. The median age in most of the countries in sub-Saharan Africa. As in half the people are less than 18. Half the people are less than 18. And Africa also is projected, I think, to be the most populous, continent by 2050 as well. So if you look at the population of young people in the country, like 70% of the people in this continent being less than 30, that's a lot. 70% are less than 30 in sub-Saharan Africa. These people need opportunities. These people need jobs. These people need employment. If there isn't that, all of us know from conflict theory, there's going to be conflict with the governments or with those or with the rulers. Climate change, I spoke a little bit about Lake Chad. Floods in Africa, things that had never been seen before, drought, temperature increases, and all these issues, this is a global thing, but also it's affecting Africa a lot. And I think there has been, I've been following some of the United Nations conferences whereby people say that Africa is reducing the least amount of, carbon emissions, but, we feel the greatest branch of those who are emitting most of it. So climate change is also a big issue in Africa, and is another reason why people are forced to move. So in 2020, we find that about 21 million Africans lived in an African country which was different from their own. And that number has gone up. I think the latest data that I saw right now for 2025 was about 35 million people. 35 or 43 million people. So millions of Africans actually are living in a country in Africa which is not their own country. So there is movement of people within the country, because many people assume that most Africans move to Europe or other parts of the world. Actually, it is not true. And only about 23% of African migrants live in Europe. Only. And that is the highest. And that is the highest amount of migrants, of African migrants. Most of the migrants are within Africa, in other African countries. Okay, so in the rest of the world, as I said, about only 27% of African migrants live in Europe, as we said, because people think that, many Africans, are out of the continent. No, most of the African migration is within Africa. So that is a very interesting thing too, because I think it is difficult. One, it is very difficult to move. And if you've seen the terrible or, the videos whereby Africans were trying to cross from North Africa, like sometimes from Libya, from Malta, going to Italy or going to Spain or going to France, you notice that they're very terrible videos. You find, maybe in a boat this size, you find these 2,000 people with mothers and their children. So many Africans tend to migrate within Africa, not outside Africa. So within Africa, these are some of the prominent routes, and actually our studies has confirmed some of these routes. You find that there's a lot of movement into South Africa. I think we could argue that some of the movement that goes up north, for example, the one that comes from the east to north, perhaps they're using the north as an intermediary, and they're planning to go into Europe. And also, if you look at the other big one for West Africa, which is going up, I think those ultimately their goal is to go to Europe. But there's a lot of movement going down into South Africa. You can see that, from East Africa, and actually there's some routes which are not shown here because my friends in South Africa speak about a huge Nigerian contingent also in South Africa. So the question is, so with all this movement, if we've established that it is true that people move a lot within Africa and outside Africa, does this movement then create a risk for trafficking? And I think the answer, is out there. Definitely depends. There are people who have protective factors. If you look at somebody like maybe students who come from another country, if you came to ground, for example, as a student, there's one protective factor is the fact that you are within an institution, right? You are legal, right? You are protected by an institution. So you are less likely to be exploited and you're less likely to be trafficked. But if you came here to this country or another country, and maybe you are not documented, you are not networked within any institution, you do not have a good income, you don't understand the culture, you don't understand the language, then of course the chances of you being exploited increase. And that might include human trafficking. So of course, there are heightened risk for people who move from one place to another, but you could say that there are many mitigating factors. So it's not everybody who moves or who migrates is likely to be exploited or trafficked. It depends with the circumstances under which somebody migrates. But these vulnerabilities might include, as we said, immigration status, legal protections if you don't have those, no networks, if you don't have a job, economic needs, language barriers, cultural differences, stigma, and discrimination. In Europe, they speak about the concept of social exclusion. So what is human trafficking? What is human trafficking? So this is what we study. According to the Palermo Protocol, which was signed in 2000, human trafficking is the recruitment, transfer, harboring, receipt of person by use of threats, coercion, abduction, fraud, deception, or the abuse of a position or vulnerability, and or the giving or receiving of payments or benefits to achieve the consent of a person, to have control over this person for the purposes of exploitation. And the protocol speaks about three main elements in trafficking, that is acts, means, and purpose. So acts include, the act of, those, the traffic, so for example, like recruitment, transportation, transfer, harboring, and receipt of a person. And means is how you do it. It could be through deception, it could be through fraud, it could be through force. That's how we define the means. And purpose, of course, is just for one reason, for the purposes of exploitation. And most of the exploitation is categorized under either labor exploitation or sex exploitation. For child trafficking, though, so that is a legal definition. And we've had many challenges translating this into research questionnaires and making people understand what is trafficking. If the definition of trafficking is this complex in a half a paragraph, it is very legal. Can you imagine now going to do research in these countries whereby there's not one word for human trafficking, right? So this has been one of the challenges of our work and another project that I'm going to speak about. So just to clarify that for child trafficking, we don't have to prove means. So for you to be prosecuted in trafficking, we've got to prove all the three elements. We've got to prove the act, the means, and the purpose. But for child trafficking, we do not have to prove any means. So for a child, basically human trafficking is a recruitment. We remove all that means by means of, so you recruit, you transport, you transfer, you have a child for exploitation. That's sufficient for a child. But for anybody under 18, the means also has got to be proven. Now, we've had issues with our work because when we work, some of our projects is with the UNODC, and the UNODC trains judges and magistrates and prosecutors and police officers in the countries that we work in, and they train them in things like, for example, trauma-informed cross-examination. So if you have a victim, how do you cross-examine them in a manner that enhances their cooperation in the process? And in many countries, actually, even though there's trafficking, the prosecutors are struggling to prove all the three elements, because these laws in all these countries are copy and paste from the Palermo Protocol, right? Or the TVPA. The TVPA in the US is the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, also signed by Bush in 2000. The definitions are very similar, but we are really struggling to convict what we can see is trafficking, because the traffickers, most of them have money. And, when their attorneys actually, when they defend them, it is very hard for prosecutors to always prove all the three elements. So you find that many traffickers have been prosecuted under other crimes instead of trafficking, which actually has higher penalties in most of the countries that we work in. But we've seen some progress now. And our work in Senegal, the prosecutions increased by 150% last year alone. We also have a project with the UNODC where we are training the magistrates and police officers. And now in many countries that we work in, we've helped the government to establish anti-trafficking police units. And these police officers are spread all over the country, and they're trained in the Palermo Protocol. They are trained in trafficking laws, and they're trained in act, means, and purpose, and all that. So this has been a very, very interesting and a project that we've had with the UNODC. If you get a chance, you could see that in our website. So, of course, the human trafficking, because of the previous slide, it is confused with many, many things. Yeah. Some people even confuse human trafficking with immigration. Some people confuse human trafficking with smuggling. Some people confuse human trafficking with their movement. The difference between human trafficking and smuggling, human trafficking, there's got to be exploitation. In human trafficking, we must have exploitation. In smuggling, you could be smuggled without being exploited. But smuggling basically is crossing one country or another without documentation. You pay somebody. I could pay somebody in Mexico to take me to New York. He's smuggling me, okay? And maybe when I'm in New York, I know where I'm going, I know whom I'm going to meet, and I'll be okay. No exploitation, right? But also people can be trafficked without movement. You can be trafficked right where you are. So just to clarify that. However, there's an intersection. I think in the process of being smuggled, especially what we are seeing in Libya right now with sub-Saharan Africans, you pay somebody and then they reach someone and they're like, oh, this is free labor. And then they exploit you. And actually, we have many cases of organ trafficking right now going on among Africans in Libya because, the smugglers are also working with other criminals who need something. So they might tell you, we're taking you from point A to point B, but at point A1, something else happens and you're exploited. So 45% of all identified victims of trafficking in persons worldwide had been trafficked across international borders, according to the 2022 immigration. So let me tell you a true story. 2 months ago, I got a call. It was about 2 in the morning. I got a call. It was about 2 in the morning. And, I was told that there was this girl from Uganda who was very, very sick, nearly dying, had gone there through what we are going to discuss, which is bilateral labor agreements. And she was sleeping in the bathroom, exploited, and they refused to let her go. This is 2 months ago. This is a true story, 2 months ago. And so she said she wanted to leave. They did not want her to leave at all. They said, no, you could not leave. You have to continue working. Because when she came, the people who brought her, she had paid $2,000, fee for it to be brought there. So you owe them. So a big chunk of your salary goes towards paying them, which means that you have to work over a period of time to pay that loan, right? But she got sick after about 3 or 4 months. So she could not continue working to pay that loan. She came there legally, papers, everything. But of course, once you land in those places, they confiscate your passport, you cannot go. So she could not leave. So I called, I have some colleagues with the IOM, International Organization of Migration, and then we worked with Lawyers Without Borders, and we began the process of trying to remove her from her place. So they contacted the police there. The police went there. It's very interesting. When the police went to where she was, the name that was in the registry and the name on her passport were different. So they're like, it's not you, so you can't leave. Even though you're sick and you're dying, you could not leave. So the family that she was working for and the people who brought her were all conniving, making sure that she will not leave. To cut the story short, we were able to remove her after about 1 week. And she was in a shelter for about 2 weeks. I am shelter in about 2 weeks. And then she left and went to a country in Uganda. And she's been in hospital for a long time, actually, since. I think now she's getting better, right? So that is what I'm saying, that all the studies that we're seeing about people who've moved, there's just a lot of exploitation. Even people who are moving somewhere legally, there's a lot of exploitation. And so in this work, that is, I say, we do work with many people. So actually, I worked with the Department of State. I worked with the International Organization of Migration and Players Without Borders. And after that, we were able to get her out. The passport was completely lost, could not be found in the whole house. It was found after a 4-day search in that house. But these things are real. They're real. And when it's the real person, when you see the picture of the person, when you hear the story, when you're speaking with people on the phone, when you can hear what is happening, when you can hear people shouting and screaming at each other, and it's one case, then the research, the data actually comes to life. So that's what I'm saying. People who move are more likely to end up in forced labor exploitation. So, for example, she was in forced labor exploitation because if you get sick, you should be let go. You should go. But they were willing for her to die. They did. They were not willing. She was sleeping actually in the bathroom. This girl, as sick as she was. But these people are so. When you ask them, why did you come? You've had so many stories. They're like, there was nothing. There's nothing. So they are really driven by economic need. And then there's demand for cheap labor in other parts of the world. So it's very interesting because right now, if human trafficking is modern day slavery, today we have more people in slavery than at any other time in the history of the world. You know, according to the ILO, it's about 45 million people, right? It's about 45 million people. So here we have countries which have issues that we just discussed before. Global warming is making things worse. And then here we have demand and need for cheap labor. And I think many economists would agree that, economics, subsist on two things here, free or cheap labor, because those are the biggest costs of production. Okay, so I'll just kind of skim through this, but you can see there's a lot of effect for these girls. They're mostly girls who are domestic servants. This really affects them, as you can see from the studies. Yeah, so I'll also kind of skim through this because the next slide, I think, speaks about our work in Senegal. Exactly, our work in Senegal. So in Senegal, we are working in a place called Kédougou. Kédougou it borders Mali. I don't know if you can see Kédougou from here. Yes, down there, you can see where we have the border with Guinea and Senegal. You can see Kédougou. So that's where our project is. It's a very hot place, very different from Rhode Island. We were there once and it was 130 degrees. In the gold mines. So we have gold mines which produce gold, and the gold goes to Dubai. And the amount of gold that goes to Dubai is about 5 tons every year. So somebody is making some good money from that. It is artisanal, which means that it is not regulated. It is artisanal and small-scale gold mining. This is not like a form of gold mining by a company, Rhode Island Gold Company. No, it's artisanal, but it produces 5 tons of gold per year to Dubai. That means somebody is very rich and could give a lot of money to this institute to expand. Somebody is making a lot of money. So the people who mine the gold are young men between about 14, which means there is child labor there, and about 30, right? So these young men are away from their families. So there's a lot of sex work. Now, Senegal is one of the only countries in the ECOWAS where sex work is legal under 2 conditions. You have to be 21 and older, and every 2 months you have to do a medical test to show that you don't have an STD. Okay? So sex work is legal. So all the girls from all these parts, but mostly Nigeria, know that. So they cross all these countries by road. They are smuggled by road to go to Senegal. The reason I'm saying they're smuggled is because while the ECOWAS has a framework for free movement, which means you can move from one country to another as long as you're a member of the ECOWAS, these are children. Most of these are children, So they lie about their age. I've seen these girls. They are 15, they're 14, right? So they cross these countries, and these are the parts that we have mapped from our study. cross these countries to land in Kedugu. So there are two issues. One, Senegal is a francophone country, so they speak French. Okay, merci beaucoup. Okay, that's what I'm speaking. Anybody who speaks French here? Speak French, bonjour. So Senegal is a francophone country. These girls are from Nigeria, which is Anglophone. Besides that, I don't even think they completed high school. Complete high school. So you can see how vulnerable these people are. And they are coming there. And so they are supposed to be, even though sex work is actually legal. So our goal is to establish among the sex workers how many people are victims of trafficking. Now, when you speak to them, they tell you they have been told they're going to Europe by the smugglers. They've been taken to Europe or to Dubai, as if Dubai is a good place, as if even just going to Europe like that will change their lives. So you can say that, people who are moving, sometimes even for the right reasons, really, are being actually taken to places where the exploitation is bad. We've had girls die there. So we have a shelter in Kedugu that keeps them. And we take care of them for about 2 months. And then we return them to Nigeria. It's very costly, actually. In Africa, there's a very little demand for air travel. So even Senegal to Nigeria is about $900. It's a very short distance. It's about $900, right? And it is, I'm not going to say all the stories here of the things that we see, but it's bad. It's very bad. And the boys themselves so there are two layers of exploitation. So first of all, we have children, boys, who are working these gold mines. They go down, 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 because I said this is artisanal. Okay? They are the ones who are trying to get the gold and, do all the work, right? And then because some of the men are away from their families, now there's demand for sex workers. But most of these girls are being brought by people also who are known and who have a lot of power and authority in the community. So that is why I just said before that we have increased successful prosecutions by perpetrators for perpetrators by 150% through the training of judges and magistrates to really understand the issue and to do this. So this has been a very interesting. So we just completed the endline study. So this was a baseline study. We did the intervention, and right now we're doing the endline study. So it will be very interesting to see how that has gone. So that should be out by around February. So because of all this exploitation and this, human trafficking, so countries have tried to come up with mechanisms to try to really protect these people. People must move, we said. So we have what is called bilateral labor agreements, or sometimes multilateral labor agreements between countries, sometimes if it is more than two. So these are tools for the regulation of governance of short-term or temporary labor workers between two states. And I think in this country, we have farm workers who come in here under HB2, H1?
HB, H1, H2.
Yeah, exactly. And the seasonal workers, they come here, they do the work, and then they go back. All those are part of what are called BLAs, or bilateral labor agreements. So they're supposed to be legally binding, structured, and also, they give benefits to both countries, by providing protections for workers, because there's a demand for labor. And the ILO and IOM have been really at the center of this to create some global guidance on developing BLAs. And they are partnering with countries, especially in Africa, because many people are moving from Africa. So this is a response to all this exploitation. So specifically, these agreements should protect workers, should uphold human rights, and also they should eliminate harassment, violence. They should make sure that these people are paid well and on time, and they should prohibit the confiscation of identity documents. Actually, nobody should take your document, but this happens every time people go to work in the Middle East. The first thing they do is to get your passport. If you speak to all the girls who've come back, the first thing, even before you sit, you just enter the house. Give me your passport. Very first thing. 100% of the girls say that. I don't know how many people will give somebody a passport here, if even a driver's license. Give me a driver's license. I don't know how people will do that there. But again, this is really just exploiting people. And also within Africa, there have been some other policies, like the African Union Migration Policy Framework. And regionally in the ECOWAS, there's a free movement protocol. And also in the South African area, there's a strategic plan to combat trafficking in persons. And also within countries, there are some policies to try to help people. Basically, the goal is the acknowledgement that people will move, and it is okay for them to move because there is demand for them. And if they are going to move here, we do need to protect their rights. However, even though there are all these policy frameworks, like the guy I spoke to about Uganda, came to Jordan under a BLA between Uganda and Jordan. That BLA did not protect her rights. In fact, actually, I'll not even tell you the full story. We tried to work with the Ugandan embassy in Jordan. They were helpless. They could not do anything. The Ugandan embassy in Jordan were helpless. We tried. Talked to them. They tried to call. They did not even pick their call. So we have these frameworks, they are not as strong as they are, states also like cohesion in how to regulate this lack of resources. For example, the Ugandan embassy said we were powerless. That's what they said. They said we were powerless. We could not do anything. This was stigmas and marginalization and just lack of respect for these people who come to work. So I'm going to speak a little bit about our work in conclusion, which is in Zambia and Malawi. In Zambia and Malawi, we have a project whose goal is to reduce labor trafficking. How many minutes do I have?
You're fine.
I'm fine, Aisha. Yeah. So in Zambia and Malawi, we have a project whose goal is to reduce labor trafficking among youth and young adults who are aged 18 to 37. And the reason why we said that, we know youth are defined as poor up to 35, 18 to 35 by the UN. But the reason why we work 37 is because the questions that we ask in our questionnaire ask them what happened to them over the past 2 years. So if you're 37, of course, while you're still youth, which is 35 legally. And we have estimated already the labor trafficking prevalence in those two countries, in this population, and also the goal of the project is to understand the context of labor trafficking and also to conceptualize financial well-being among youth and young adults. So I'm going to speak a little bit about, I know the issues with formatting there, but basically this is a 3-phased project. The first phase is the baseline, whereby using very, very, very large sample sizes, we're using a mixed method study to understand the drivers, facilitators, risk factors around trafficking, who is going where, who is being trafficked, where are they being trafficked, just some of the stuff that I spoke about before. But we are also establishing the prevalence of labor trafficking among this target group. And also we're looking at the gaps and policy gaps among stakeholders, policy officers, government officials, and all that. And then we're using this data to actually design or co-design a project that is based on the theories of financial capability, basically digital financial inclusion as a tool that could reduce the risks of being labor trafficked. And then the third phase will be an endline study and a final evaluation of the project. So these are some of the questions, the perception of, the perception of stakeholders, and their views on services, policy gaps, and we have some of the quantitative research questions there, looking at financial capability and the impact of financial capability interventions on labor trafficking. And of course, we have other questions there that I did not show. We are basically going to look at the difference between endline and baseline. In Sierra Leone, we've been very successful by doing child trafficking. We've reduced the prevalence of child trafficking in Sierra Leone, and I know somebody comes from Sierra Leone. If you look at we've reduced that. We've reduced the rate. And actually, we've been invited by the president to go back. I know Mada Bio, the president. He's my friend. I don't know if you like him, so never know. Sometimes you say, my friend, I don't like him. Anyhow, but, just very quick, in Sierra Leone, we've reduced the rate of child trafficking by an average of about 20% through our project. So those projects are in Zambia and Malawi, but the data that I'm going to present today is just based on Malawi. So we had tons of interviews with 30 youths and young adults, 24 key informers. We had 8 focus groups, and we also had large household samples, as you can see. So those are the phases that I spoke about, and so I'm not going to spend a lot of time in these phases. This project is between 2022 to 2028. It's a 6-year project, also funded by the U.S. Department of State. So those are our partners in those countries. We have the University of Malawi, we have the University of Zambia, and within the US, we have Chapel Hill, we have Urbana-Champaign, and WashU in St. Louis. And the Catholic Relief Services is actually doing the phase 2 part of the intervention. So these are the places that we're working in. So in Zambia, we have 2 districts: Sesheke, Livingstone, Lusaka, and Chipata. And in Malawi, we're working in Blantyre and Mangochi, for those who know those countries. So these are preliminary findings from Blantyre. As you can see, the proportion of labor trafficking victims, you can see about 15%. In Blantyre, about 10%. In Mangochi. And at risk also is about 15%. 15% in Blantyre and about 9% in Mangochi. And the proportion of those who are trafficked across borders, it's quite a lot, 64% in Blantyre and 74% in Malawi. And those who are at risk, 17% in Blantyre and about 13% in Mangochi. So this is what we reported. Close to 90% reported abuses took place in South Africa. That is where they were. And South Africa, if you know the history of South Africa, there have been issues there with a lot of xenophobia, but we moved there because it is like the place of opportunity. But also there are many risks of people who are moving in there. So that is some of the issues. So we're not surprised that most of them moved to South Africa and most of the abuses took place in South Africa among those who moved. And this is where we are looking at the abuses. At recruitment, within the employment, in your personal life, in the degrading conditions, were you able to move or not? Some people were kept because they could not pay debt, like the guy I spoke about. And some faced violence, which is physical, sexual, or verbal violence. So we also see that respondents described and reported linkages between migrating for economic reasons and increased vulnerability to trafficking. For example, you can see some of what we're saying. I think the first factor can be lack of financial activity. We expect that, and you can see the second person there. Most young women are independent, so they migrate to look for ways of earning money. So at the end of the day, we can see it is just basically poverty and economic opportunity for these people. So we also found that loan access for migration costs linked to trafficking. Like it is very hard to get access to loans. People want to do something, but they cannot get access to loans. So there is an issue, just lack of capital. So challenges during migration, which could increase vulnerability. For example, lack of resources for travel, difficult, dangerous travel conditions, not so different from people who move from South America to here, challenging encounters with law enforcement, such as border crossings, very similar to what we see here. So based on all that, when I was coming here, I was thinking, so what, so looking at people who might be here or where I'm thinking this research going, what are the areas that perhaps, in the field of human trafficking, where could we still do some work, based on what I'm reading in the literature and based on what we know. I think there are great opportunities in terms of now using big data, using GIS, statistics to understand the movement of people and human trafficking. And, we can document drivers and facilitators of trafficking using GIS. So, for example, if I was to do a study in a whole country, Malawi is a small country, if I was to do a study in Malawi, you could do a national prevalence study. Personally, I'm not for national prevalence study. So, for example, the ILO, the UNODC, and the ILO, the UNODC, and another organization from Australia, every 2 years they release global prevalence rates of human trafficking. And the truth is, nobody really knows, right? Every year they release, global rates. I prefer to do a more very hotspot or district-based approach where you can actually have an enumeration area and say that we are going to do it in Providence, for example. Yeah, because if you look at the prevalence rates, which are the national aggregate data, right? First of all, they don't do studies in the whole country. How would you do that unless you inserted questions in a census, right? Or unless you have a very, very good national representative sample. So first of all, they really don't do that. Most of it, we find that it is just extrapolation. So for example, if they didn't have enough funds, they did the studies in Vermont and then estimated what happened in Rhode Island. Number two, we also find that most of that data really underestimates the prevalence of trafficking because it relies on administrative data. If you look at administrative data, we all know that it has a lot of weaknesses. Yeah. So, for example, if you look at the uniform crime reports in the US, right, it is based on what is reported, crimes that are reported, right? If you look at domestic violence, we all know that domestic violence is very much underreported because not all incidences are reported, right? So, if you're relying on the FBI or your BI for those records, it's okay. It's administrative data, but not all people not all domestic violence incidences are reported. It's the same thing with human trafficking. So these big entities, which get a lot of money, the UNODC and the ILO, rely heavily on administrative data. But we know how weak that data is. That is why I prefer these huge surveys. So there's a need there for JS. So if I was able to establish like Mangochi, for example, if I was able to like map out the whole of Mangochi, actually I can even go further. First of all, I can establish the prevalence of human trafficking in Mangochi, okay? And then actually there are many techniques to really help me establish the prevalence of trafficking in the small sub-regions of Mangochi. Now, if I found that in the whole of Mangochi, for example, like I showed, it's about 15% of people are victims of labor trafficking, youth and young adults. That is in the whole of Mangochi. If I found that perhaps in one place it's 25, in the north part it is 25%, and in the southern part of Mangochi it's about 5%, then I should ask myself, why is it 25% in the north? Because 25% is more than the average, which is 15. And maybe there are drivers and there are issues happening there. So that helps me actually to kind of refocus my resources and my intervention in that part than in the southern part, because we only have 5%. I'm not saying 5% is useless or there's no need for intervention, but we always want to make sure that we focus our resources in the places where the problem is more severe, right? So we can have, so right now we are writing a paper also from Sierra Leone, whereby we've looked at the micro data of this aggregate data of the district. We worked in 4 districts in Sierra Leone, and now we are looking at region by region and asking ourselves, why was child trafficking so high here compared to here? What is happening here? Are there industries, for example? Are there no schools, for example? Is there like increased orphanhood, for example, in this place? And I think GIS can be very helpful in helping us, locate, things like industries in those areas. Another area that I think we still need to do some research on is to just build the knowledge base on the causes and patterns of migration and intersections with the vulnerability of trafficking, because these issues look the same, but then they're different. Once you get a little closer, they're different. So I've said that the experiences are very similar for people coming from Central South America into the US, right? And people coming from like Central East Africa into South Africa. But then the contexts are also very, very different, right? So I think mapping that out is very, very important. Something that I've begun to read of late is the use of blockchain technology. I can tell you we have friends who are very good in this type of thing. I'm not one of them. But I began to see people write a little bit about the use of this technology to verify migrants' identities, track their movements, like real time, and facilitate access to services, and to monitor people as they move real time. So that means that if you can monitor them real time, then there's an opportunity to use technology to disrupt trafficking. So these are opportunities that, I thought maybe might be interesting to the audience that is here. The other two, which are in between number 2 and 3, I think, are very general, and I think many people are already doing that. But number 1 and 4, I think, is something that we might all consider. And the NSF actually will be very interested in this type of research. So those are just some of the resources for the presentation today. And so that is the end of it. And thank you so much again. So